Welcome back to the Thinc conversation. Still with me is Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, former head of protocol for Nelson Mandela and the ambassador. But Kingsley, I've asked you a question before we took a break to say how are those systematic challenges in the Africa Free Trade Agreement making the G20 declaration meaningful or hollow?
You know, one of the critical unblocking feature of the Africa Trade Agreement is contained in the declaration. Is the movement of capital, the movement of capital, cross-border movement of capital, of money, which has been a huge challenge because the transaction is done using the SWIFT system. And if you look at what the declaration says, it makes a pronouncement around this. But it's mum when it comes to the discussion on the reform of the IMF, the Bretton Woods institution in general. And it still says a lot of research needs to be done. And that's where a lot of hurdles are. And that's where the question of the SWIFT would come in. But the elephant in the room, Prof, during this discussion has been the new system, the transaction system that the Chinese are using, the CPIS, the CIPS 2, that they are using to transact amongst members, which actually has shown the ability to move fast, much cheaper in terms of the movement of capital. I think that was not thoroughly discussed. As I'm saying, there's tension around the multipolarity. And this multipolarity, it's also unsettling financial institutions, particularly the Bretton Woods institution. There's a fear about, for instance, the emergence of the BRICS Bank that actually provides some finance and capital around member states. So this tensions that are arising because of this multipolarity that is not clearly defined, it's struggling. As Gramsci said, you know, the old order is dead and the new one is struggling to be born. As this new one is struggling to be born, you're going to see these tensions emerging and so on. And that's hamstrung some of the decisions that are contained in the Africa Trade Agreement. For instance,
and yet, Dr. Kingsley, I think you were part of the early cohort that were prepared in the Oliver Tambo era. And if you remember, President Mbeki tried to establish a Pan-African fund to deal exactly with this thing. And that Pan-African fund was supposed to use the liquidity of the South African economy in terms of the pension funds, the insurance reserves, medical aid reserves, and all those things. How has this G20 declaration opened a space for South Africa to actually use its liquidity to fund infrastructure and start to make sure that Africa free trade and infrastructure starts to happen? Remember, I'm referencing you to the African Renaissance vision of former President Mbeki.
You know, Prof, there's been a discussion in the last few months, I think it began in earnest early this year, around the utilization of the pension fund to fund some of infrastructure programs within the continent. And I think because of the ambivalence within the leaders, you're unlikely to see this taking place. The challenge that we have is the absence of strategic leadership that we had during the Mbeki time and OBJ, Obasanjo's time, and Meles and Bouteflika, who were able to pull the intellectual capacity of the continent to look at a broader Pan-Africanist approach to some of these issues. Since they've stepped out of the theater of politics, you are no longer seeing the type of a consolidated approach around Pan-African issues, not only in terms of trade, also looking at the resolution of conflicts. I mean, the Sudan is an abandoned area. I can tell you, if those leaders were still around here, they will be flying every day to the Sudan to try to find a peaceful solution. But no one cares about this. Instead, we're looking at trying to resolve the Ukrainian conflict.
But, Ambassador, we have seen the high involvement of private sector. I mean, we have seen Standard Bank was very visible. We have seen Rand Merchant Bank was very visible. We have seen Investec was very visible. We have seen even institutions like Harris Partners, which is leading in some of the infrastructure projects in the continent, they were visible. How has this declaration opened space or created a platform for our private sector partners to now come together and begin to say, how can we resuscitate the Mbeki and Obasanjo vision within the Ramaphosa success of this G20 arrangement?
Prof, this declaration does not deal in terms of those details. It deals with the broad strategic issues.
Okay.
What still needs to be done is amongst member states within the African continent to deal with non-tariff barriers, which are what the organization is empowered now, the Africa Free Trade entity in Accra, is to look at those issues that are inhibiting free trade, intra-African trade. Not only that, but also harnessing and consolidating the resources of the African continent to use them to bargain with the rest of the world. So those are challenges that are going to take time to resolve, but they need political will within the continent. This agreement will not unlock those issues. The political will is going to unlock some of those challenges that are built there.
Okay, let's talk about Cyril Ramaphosa, and South Africa's display of its soft power. You worked as part of the cohort under Oliver Tambo, who led the ANC at the height of the Cold War, when it was very, very warm. What parallels can you draw between the two leadership styles as displayed in the G20 and at the UN during the canvassing of the Harare Declaration endorsement? What parallels can you draw, especially how America was dealt with? I mean, I saw similarities. Can you share with us? You were there.
Prof, there's one thing that it's less spoken about. It's called the United Nations Consensus Resolution on Apartheid and its Consequences. That was the resolution that Oliver Tambo worked on it with Mbeki and Aziz Pahad. It started as a Harare Declaration, basically a blueprint for the negotiation process in South Africa. But it was then elevated to the United Nations. I think it was the last resolution that was taken by consensus within the United Nations. So that showed the diplomatic skills of how the country can navigate the most difficult thing, because that institutional knowledge still exists. If that resolution was not adopted at the UN, we would have been in trouble in terms of the negotiation. So that's a memory that is there. And Oliver Tambo, actually, it ended up costing his life. He got a stroke because he was working on this consensus resolution. But what we are seeing now to develop consensus resolution, I think President Ramaphosa has done fantastic work to bring this wealth of knowledge and to use that to harness what we needed to achieve in terms of this agreement. Because to reach a consensus during the Cold War was the most difficult time. Now we are operating in a total different era, but it's still difficult because this era, it's fraught with this multipolarity that raises suspicions. So if you look at the two and the epoch under which they happen, they have their own dynamics, but actually it has shown the skills that South Africa possess in terms of negotiating and navigating the most difficult diplomatic space. And I think this government has done very well in terms of reaching this consensus.
Just to reflect, did we worsen or improve the US-South Africa relations in how we left the United States of America at the periphery of such a historic declaration, which reads like a global government of unity statement of intent?
No, we didn't leave the Americans out. Remember, the Americans decided this time around they are not going to participate in the substantive discussion of this. Whatever reason they have, that's the decision they took. At the last minute, they then came back to say they would like to participate at the closing ceremony for the handover of the G20 because they are the next host. That's where I think we made serious mistake. We showed amateurish behavior in terms of our diplomatic skill. Why am I saying this, Prof? it was not necessary to tell the Americans that you can't send a junior person. You know better. States are sovereign, and states determine their own delegation. It doesn't matter. It's heads of state. That's why every gathering, international gathering of this nature, you'd have a meeting of heads of state and representative of their own countries, because they are sovereign. So to tell them that you can't send a junior person, I thought that was crossing the line, because it really violates the basic tenets of how you conduct diplomatic relations. More so, a chargé d'affaires. A chargé d'affaires has all powers conferred on him in this case by his president, to represent his president. It's like an ambassador. An ambassador is a representative of his president. So a chargé d'affaires carries the same weight.
So in short, because we're losing time, in short, you're saying that we might have strained the relations that were possibly recovering as we're discussing the bilateral trade agreement. Just quickly.
We lost it. What South Africa should have said, if the Americans downgrade their participation, was to say, now that you were coming to Nasrec for the closing, for the purpose of handover, a handover will be done at DECO, and you'll be informed of the date and appropriate people to preside over it, and leave it there. And not go into the juniors and so on. That doesn't make sense. States are not juniors.
Okay.
You know?
That brings us to the end of this edition. Thanks to Ambassador Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, South Africa has cemented itself as a significant player in global affairs. This is not new. The country has always had men and women with diplomatic prowess. They use soft power to influence the world. The 4 Nobel Peace Prizes are testimony to South Africa's commitment to global peace, international justice, and abhorrence of crimes against humanity. G20 extended this influence to include climate justice, the promotion of equality amongst nations and people, global debt reduction to support world economic growth, and an emphatic message against the bullying of sovereign nations by any nation. The success of the implementation of the G20 declaration is etched in this principle. That's all from the Thinc conversation on BDTV. I'm Lucky Mathebula. Goodbye.